The room is quiet in a way that feels intentional, not empty, the kind of silence that carries expectation, and as Mehdi Hasan stands slightly to the side, observing rather than participating, his posture reflects something between curiosity and deep respect, because for him this moment is not foreign yet never ordinary, a gathering of Muslims preparing for prayer that carries centuries of meaning in movements that might look simple to an outsider, but are loaded with memory, discipline, and devotion. And as he watches the worshippers align their rows shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot, there is a visible precision that speaks of unity rather than rigidity, an unspoken understanding that in this space titles dissolve, social status fades, and what remains is a shared direction, a shared intention, and a shared submission. And Mehdi's gaze moves slowly across the room, taking in the faces of men and women who come from different backgrounds, accents, and ages, yet are synchronized by something deeper than language, and he knows that for many watching this scene from the outside, prayer is often misunderstood as ritualistic or mechanical, but what stands before him is anything but mechanical. It is human, vulnerable, and deeply personal. Because each person in that line carries private struggles, unanswered prayers, and quiet hopes they are about to place before God. And Mehdi understands that this is where Islam is most often misrepresented, because critics tend to freeze the image at the movement without listening to the intention, judging the posture without understanding the heart, and as the call to prayer fades into memory and the worshippers raise their hands to begin, Mehdi feels the shift in atmosphere, that subtle moment where the world pauses, where distractions retreat, and where every individual steps into a conversation that is both intimate and universal. And as he watches the prayer begin, he reflects internally on how rare it is in modern life to see people willingly detach from power, ego, and noise at the same time. And he thinks about how this simple act of standing, bowing, and prostrating has survived empires, colonialism, propaganda, and war, and still remains unchanged, not because it resists progress, but because it anchors meaning. And as the worshippers bow in unison, Mehdi notices something that cameras rarely capture: the expressions of relief on faces as foreheads approach the ground, the weight visibly lifting as bodies lower, and he understands that prayer is not about escape from reality, but about recalibrating one's place within it. And as he observes, he recalls how often Muslim prayer is framed in headlines as a symbol of difference or fear, yet here it is stripped of spectacle, reduced to its raw truth, humans acknowledging limitation before the infinite. And as the prayer continues, Mehdi becomes increasingly aware that this moment challenges the viewer more than it explains itself, because it asks a simple but uncomfortable question: what does it mean to submit in a world that glorifies control? And as the worshippers rise and fall in rhythm, Mehdi sees not conformity but coherence, not blind obedience but chosen humility, and he knows that for many watching this moment unfold, their understanding of Islam will depend not on theology, but on whether they are willing to see prayer not as a performance, but as a surrender. And as the Imam's voice recites verses that echo through the space, Mehdi senses the emotional gravity of words that have been recited by billions before, words that connect the present moment to a long chain of faith. And as he continues to watch, silent yet fully present, he realizes that the true power of this moment lies not in convincing anyone of Islam's truth, but in revealing its humanity, because prayer, in its essence, is not about proving anything to the world, but about standing honestly before God. And this realization quietly sets the foundation for what Mehdi's honest reaction will become. As the prayer moves forward, Mehdi Hasan's attention sharpens, not just on the physical movements, but on the emotional undercurrent that runs through the room. Because what he is witnessing is not simply worship, but a form of discipline that shapes character over time, a daily interruption that forces the believer to step away from ego-driven urgency and return to perspective. And Mehdi reflects on how often modern narratives portray Islam as demanding or harsh, yet what he sees here is a rhythm designed to soften the human being, to remind them multiple times a day that no matter how important they think they are still dependent, still accountable, and still fragile. And as the worshippers remain focused, undistracted by phones or noise, Mehdi considers how rare sustained attention has become in a hyper-connected world, and how prayer stands almost as an act of resistance against constant consumption. And he thinks about how critics often ask why Muslims pray the way they do, why the structure, why the repetition, without realizing that Repetition is not redundancy but reinforcement. The same way love is not diminished by being expressed repeatedly, and as the congregation moves into prostration, Mehdi notes the symbolism that is often overlooked, the forehead touching the ground not as humiliation but as liberation. Because in that posture, the believer admits what modern culture avoids, that control is limited and certainty is fragile. And he knows that this is precisely why prayer unsettles some observers, because it contradicts the idea that fulfillment comes from dominance or self-sufficiency. And as he watches the quiet intensity of the moment, Mehdi recalls conversations he has had in studios and debates, where Islam is discussed in abstract terms, dissected intellectually while ignoring its lived reality, and here, in front of him, is that reality, embodied rather than theorized, and he realizes that no argument can capture what this scene conveys without words: the collective humility, the shared stillness, the emotional safety of standing among others who are equally imperfect. And as the prayer continues, Mehdi becomes aware of the subtle emotional spectrum in the room. Some faces calm, others strained, some tearful, others steady, and he understands that prayer does not erase pain but gives it direction. And he reflects on how often Muslim prayer is viewed through a political lens, framed as identity rather than intimacy, yet here it is deeply personal, each person whispering their own silent supplications between movements. And Mehdi thinks about the broader implications of this misunderstanding, how fear grows when rituals are observed without empathy, when posture is judged without context, and when faith is reduced to headlines rather than human experience. And as the Imam's recitation continues, Mehdi listens carefully to the cadence, not translating every word but feeling the emotional weight of verses that speak of mercy, accountability, and hope. And he knows that for Muslims, prayer is not a demand placed upon God, but a reminder placed upon themselves, a recalibration of priorities that pulls them back from arrogance and despair alike. And as the worshippers rise for the final movements, Mehdi notices something profound: the absence of performance, no one praying for an audience, no applause, no recognition, just sincerity. And he recognizes that this is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Islamic prayer, its indifference to external validation. And as he stands watching, Mehdi feels his own reaction forming not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet confirmation of something he has long known: that Islam, at its core, is not about spectacle or domination, but about orientation, about knowing where one stands in relation to God and to others. And this realization deepens his respect for the act unfolding before him, because what he is witnessing is not a statement to the world but a return to the self, and that realization sets the stage for the honesty that will define his reaction. When the prayer concludes, and the final words fade into a stillness that feels earned rather than empty, Mehdi Hasan remains where he is for a moment, absorbing what lingers after the movement has ended, because the most revealing part of prayer is often what follows it: the quiet return to ordinary life, carrying an inward recalibration that outsiders rarely notice. And his honest reaction forms not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a layered understanding shaped by years of observing how Islam is discussed versus how it is lived. And he recognizes that what he has just witnessed defies the familiar narratives that reduce Muslim prayer to a political symbol or a cultural curiosity, because here there was no spectacle, no signaling, no attempt to be seen, only a collective decision to step out of the noise and reorient the self toward accountability, mercy, and restraint. And Mehdi reflects on how deeply countercultural this act is in a world that rewards constant self-assertion, where value is measured by visibility and influence. Yet in this space, worth is measured by sincerity, by the willingness to lower oneself without losing dignity. And as he thinks back on the straight lines and synchronized movements, he understands that critics often mistake unity for uniformity, failing to see that what unites these worshippers is not sameness but intention, because beneath the shared posture lie entirely different lives, worries, regrets, and hopes, all briefly aligned toward the same moral compass. And Mehdi considers how prayer quietly resists the modern impulse to fragment identity into competing roles, reminding the believer that no matter how many labels they carry, they ultimately answer to something greater than public approval. And his reaction deepens as he recalls the expressions he noticed during prostration: the subtle release in shoulders, the steadying of breath, the momentary surrender that offers relief rather than fear. And he realizes that this is where much misunderstanding begins, because surrender in popular discourse is framed as weakness, Yet here it functions as grounding, a way to step out of the exhausting performance of certainty and admit limitation without despair. And Mehdi thinks about how often Muslim prayer is judged through the lens of coercion, as though obligation negates meaning, ignoring the reality that many of life's most transformative practices, from discipline to commitment to love itself, require structure to endure. And he acknowledges that prayer's consistency is not about control but about care, a system designed to repeatedly pull the believer back from arrogance, resentment, and forgetfulness. And as he reflects, Mehdi recognizes that the absence of hierarchy within the prayer rows is not merely symbolic but pedagogical, teaching equality through physical practice rather than abstract slogans, because here no one prays closer to God by virtue of status, wealth, or influence, and this embodied equality challenges social structures that normalize privilege, and his honest reaction sharpens as he considers the broader implications of this ritual in public discourse, realizing that fear often fills the vacuum left by unfamiliarity, and that images of Muslims praying are frequently stripped of context and intention, presented as foreign or threatening precisely because they express a form of devotion that does not seek validation from the outside world. And Mehdi understands that this independence unsettles societies built on constant affirmation, because prayer answers to a different audience altogether, and he reflects on how the quiet discipline of returning to prayer day after day shapes moral habits over time, not by guaranteeing virtue but by interrupting vice, by forcing moments of pause where conscience is invited back into the conversation. And he admits that this, more than theology, is what gives prayer its social power, because communities that regularly practice humility are harder to fully dehumanize. And as Mehdi processes his reaction, he becomes acutely aware of the responsibility that comes with interpretation, knowing that moments like this are rarely amplified because they lack conflict, yet they are precisely the moments that reveal faith's true texture. And he thinks about how often Islam is spoken about without Muslims, dissected in studios while ignoring spaces like this one, where belief is enacted quietly rather than argued loudly, and his reaction settles into a firm clarity that watching Muslims pray is not meant to persuade observers of doctrinal truth but to invite them into a different moral imagination, one where accountability is personal, mercy is sought daily, and community is enacted through shared restraint rather than shared outrage. And Mehdi recognizes that this imagination directly contradicts the caricatures that portray Muslim devotion as rigid or hostile, because what he has seen is softness within discipline, vulnerability within structure, and humanity within reverence. And as he prepares to articulate his thoughts, he knows that honesty requires resisting both romanticization and dismissal, acknowledging that prayer does not erase injustice or human failure, but it does create a recurring space for reflection that modern life often denies, and he realizes that his honest reaction is ultimately grounded in respect for a practice that refuses to be reduced to sound bites, because its meaning unfolds slowly, over years of repetition and return. And as he looks one last time at the now empty prayer space, Mehdi understands that the most powerful aspect of what he witnessed is its refusal to perform, its indifference to being misunderstood, because prayer continues whether it is praised or criticized, quietly shaping those who submit to its rhythm. And in that persistence, he sees a form of strength that does not seek dominance but endurance. And his reaction resolves into a simple, unembellished truth, that in a world addicted to noise, certainty, and spectacle, the act of Muslims pausing to pray stands as a reminder that humility can be practiced, equality can be embodied, and faith can be lived without demanding the world's permission. And for Mehdi Hasan, that realization is not just intellectually compelling but deeply human, affirming that the quiet power of prayer lies not in how it appears to others, but in how it continually calls its practitioners back to who they are meant to be.